number of books. One of his books goes into the Smedley Butler affair, which was in Congress but was not published in the major newspapers. Now we come to more recent times. In 1975, there were 3 plots against Gerald Ford. There was Squeaky Fromm. There was Sarah Jane Moore, who was an undercover agent for a federal agency. She had a federal agency gun. A disabled veteran hit her elbow at the last moment and made her off the mark. Otherwise, she would have blown away Gerald Ford, who was the unelected president following Nixon. In other words, he had been the vice president
following Spiro Agnew's resignation. And he used to be on the Warren Commission.
I had talked about the Spiro Agnew-Nixon thing before it happened, and I was roundly condemned as a liar, and then it came out that I was correct about that they had a plot to remove Spiro Agnew and put in Nelson Rockefeller. So that...
so you ended up being a prophet instead.
Well, the point of the matter is that we find out things because we have sources all over the world, but what happened is Agnew resigned. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford as the vice president. Upon the downfall of Nixon, Gerald Ford, under the 25th Amendment, became the president without an election, and he in turn turned around like musical chairs and appointed Nelson Rockefeller as the vice president. And Nelson Rockefeller itched to be the president without an election. It was the Rockefellers that, in fact, in '67 put out the 25th Amendment because after the Kennedy assassination, for a while, Lyndon Johnson served as a president with no vice president. In '67, they cured that with the 25th Amendment. But the point is, Sarah Jane Moore came within a hair of blowing away Gerald Ford. A third plot against Ford did not get publicized enough in the newspapers. I put the details on my recorded telephone message at that time. Guess what happened to me? All my phones, at that time we had 20 phones devoted in rotation to the same message. There was a big bank of phones, and the Secret Service had all my phones blocked. I in fact, was in my wheelchair going to picket in front of the phone company headquarters downtown Chicago. They told me that there's nothing they can do for me, that it's national security.
So the phone company told you it was national security?
Yeah, and also somebody I knew on one of the major newspapers, we're not putting it in the paper, but you're a national security risk, Skolnick. Your phones have got to be turned off for a while. So...
You know, it sounds so far-fetched, and I'm not at all questioning your veracity at all, Sherman, but to the average listener who hasn't taken the risks and gone out on the limbs that you have, I mean, it sounds way out there.
I could tell you, take another hour to tell you about the run-ins with the Secret Service.
Well, one thing I'd want to say to our listeners is, until you've stepped out on the limbs that Sherman stepped out on, don't be too quick to discount what his stories
are. I know
are.
what I'm talking about. If I ever wrote an autobiography of the last 40-some-odd years, only my oldest friends would believe it. I've been through a lot, but our policy of organization is not to dwell on the hardships of us in our work because it discourages some of the younger members of our group, so I usually don't go much into that. I've gone into it a little bit on a few stories on my website, but generally, the problems that we've had, I've been arrested 8 times for contempt of court by the judges I accused of bribery, dragged to jail.
Yeah, you've done time without ever being convicted of anything.
Right, I've never been convicted of any crime. No. I don't commit any crimes.
Right.
But anyway, in other words, there was the plot against Franklin Roosevelt. There were 3 genuine plots against Ford. So the idea that the American Republic is by the ballot. Now you have to understand a point of my factual history to understand what I'm talking about. In the 60s and 70s, because I'm self-educated in law, I led the campaign in Illinois for the equal vote. At that time, the districts were malapportioned.
Okay.
And it's called the reapportionment cases. And I was called Mr. One Man, One Vote. I brought in the federal court and won all the cases to redo the districts on a strict basis of population, not of gerrymandering and rotten borough. Now, some people have forgotten about the redistricting. I run into people, even reporters now, that says, what's this reapportionment? But that was a big controversy in the 60s and 70s, and I brought all the cases. And it allowed me occasionally to comment on the judges on the media, but just briefly, just for less than a minute. But why do I bring that up? Because when it comes down to an election, I outraged a number of people, including some intellectuals, when I go into a discussion, mostly in the presence of guests that are third-party candidates, that third parties are not generally allowed free access to the ballot in the United States. That those that rule us do so by the bullet, not the ballot, and that therefore, and this is the part that outrages people, I urge a boycott of the elections. Why? During the Reagan administration, the vote for president fell within 1 point of 25% of those eligible to vote. I am of the opinion that historically, were the number of people eligible to vote that did actually vote fall below 25%, that
perhaps they lost
the
faith.
president would not rule by the consent of the governed. He rules by our consent. If our consent is less than 25%, how could it be said that the one that won the election is ruling by our consent? In other words, what I'm saying is that if the number of those that vote or boycott the vote, not because it's raining on election day,
right,
and not because they're apathetic, but because the American Republic does not have a provision for a position on the ballot, none of the above. Now, by the way, when Nelson Rockefeller was ratified by the Senate as vice president, an unelected vice president appointed, he testified that for the previous 11 years, and this is something that people have forgotten or don't know or has never brought to their attention, Nelson Rockefeller, in his testimony before the Senate, says that he and the Rockefeller family had not paid any taxes for the previous 11 years. The richest family on the face of the world had not paid any taxes. So that's an important point. In other words, they're ruling us by the bullet, not the ballot. How could it? They've corrupted the IRS, and there's a whole 7-part series about the corruption of the IRS on my website, which time does not permit me now to go into. I urge those that can pull up my stories to read it. To read it. I even show a picture of an IRS official's owned boat in the Caribbean that's actually a money laundering. I haven't got time to go into it. Go read the 7-part stories and judge for yourself. So there have been 4 presidents assassinated, plots to assassinate 2 presidents, and that is the bigger picture that we must understand, of which my colleagues in the assassination research movement do not ever want to go into. They do not want to discuss the details about the oil industry and so on, which are set forth in great detail in the suppressed book Farewell America, and so on. The financial picture. The one that gets the closest to it is Oliver Stone's movie. I demonstrated in court, and it was never disputed, the 11, call them stolen archives documents. In 1973, by the way, I was part of a protest march in front of the National Archives with Dick Gregory and others to open the archives and release the Kennedy brain. There, if they released it, would show that the bullets came from the front, not the back. In my series, a 4-part series on the murder of John F. Kennedy Jr. by an airplane bombing, I go into the whole history of the Kennedy family and the fact that they have come to terms with these plots and instead use it as financial blackmail. They get themselves up in the world financially because they feel they cannot correct this cabal because it's inherent in the American Republic and the ruling families, of which there's nothing they can do about it.
So you're saying that, in your opinion, the Kennedy family today is attempting to get ahead financially by...
They have. Take as an example the surviving daughter, Carolyn Kennedy Schlossberg.
Buttons.
Her husband is a big shot on the commodity markets.
Mm-hmm.
The rest, you're getting me to go into the details of that, and I'll go only briefly into that. I was the one that came up with the information that Kennedy Jr.
Mm-hmm.
was going to announce August 1st, 99,
mm-hmm.
that he was going to run for president. It was a Kennedy family secret.
Mm-hmm.
They condemned him because they said the Secret Service cannot protect you.
Mm-hmm.
And in defiance of the family, John F. Kennedy Jr. planned to run for president.
He even informed...
He made one mistake. He confided the secret to the Gore campaign, and I verified that. It leaked out, and those that opposed the Kennedy family as a dynasty had him assassinated by the bombing of his airplane, and I go into all the details.